The R1 actually gets pretty good fuel economy if you don't drive it like you stole it. So let's look at Yamaha, like I looked at Honda the other day, in terms of what they're doing going forward to meet the guidelines for emissions and fuel economy and so on. And I'm gonna switch over to the Yamaha website here, and we're gonna start with their sport bikes. So these are their super sport style, R1, R7, that kind of thing. Well, guess what? The R1 actually gets pretty good fuel economy if you don't drive it like you stole it. Just, if you take it easy on the street, if you drive it the way they're going to run it for the emissions checks, for the fuel economy checks, it gets 41 miles per gallon. I would bet with that stock exhaust, with the stock tune, that it's very, very clean. But how many of us leave the stock exhaust? How many of us leave the stock tune? But Yamaha's going, hey, from the factory, it meets the requirements, right? That's why they've got new ones coming out. We're not looking at the same R1 we were looking at 10 years ago. Similar, but there have been tweaks. The R7, I'm 90% sure that the R7, the reason they did it, and the reason they didn't just make like the R6-2 is emissions. Yeah, they wanted to change up the bike to make it a little more mainstream rather than a race bike, but they also wanted to make sure that they weren't clouding the two models, because they wanted to make one of them very emissions compliant. Now they've got the racing R6. They can still offer it. It's still its own thing. Doesn't have to meet emissions. It's not a street bike. And then the R3. I mean, no problem making that meet emissions, right? That's going to be excellent. But keep in mind, the R7, 54 miles per gallon if you don't drive it like an idiot. How many of us really would? But if they're doing their emissions checks, if they're doing their fuel economy checks, that's a good number. Hyper nakeds, these are what they're going to sell the most of, right? Or at least a significant percentage. They have really focused on the higher end of this line, but they're all new. The MT-09 and MT-10 are all bikes that you've got a big engine, right? But you're not going to stress it to meet the requirements of the emissions check, because you don't have to run it like you stole it for the emissions check. You have to set a certain pace that they lay out. But the bigger engine working less hard can be more efficient. And then aftermarket goes, hey, we can make this really fast. But for the test, it's easy. It's easier for them to be more compliant. And then they're going to sell a ton of MT-07s and MT-03s, which bring it down even further. Because while the media talks about the MT-09 and MT-10s, actual sales, let's face it, the MT-07 and MT-03 probably sell 2 or 3 to 1 over all the other ones combined. So as long as the MT-07 and the MT-03 are at least compliant, if not extremely, so. Remember, they're averaging this across the whole product line, not just the MTs. Like it's going to be the MTs, the Rs, the XSRs, like the whole thing. Having that spread, rather than having a bunch of bikes in the middle range, where it's tough to make it compliant, you don't have enough power to weight ratio to really play with it. The MT-07 does it. But if you had like an MT-06, an MT-08, there wouldn't be enough differentiation. And then, we've got classic, the heritage bikes, right? V-Star 250. Now, we may make jokes about it, but I bet they sell a ton of that bike. Comfy, easy. If you're riding around in the city, it's perfectly fine. As a little bar hopper, it's fine. Not everybody's wrapped up in having to have a ton of power. The enthusiast market is different from the average buyer market. Something a lot of people on YouTube forget. V-Star 250s? Yeah, I bet there's a ton of them. Extremely, extremely easy bike for their emissions to be good at. Nobody is chasing every last bit of power on that bike. If it's a couple percent less powerful, nobody cares. They're not trying to beat out the competitor by half a horsepower, right? The XSR 700, also very popular bike, probably meets emissions. XSR 900, unless they've changed something, I doubt it meets emissions, but it's probably not horrible. Bolt R-Spec absolutely is going to meet emissions. But there you go. They've gotten that into a system where, remember, because it's averaged across sales, not just models, the V-Star, the R-Spec, and the XSR 700 counteract the XSR 900. So the enthusiast gets their bike without having to have it totally neutered. Because Yamaha can go, hey, EPA, yeah, this one doesn't meet it, but our average is in the required envelope. Adventure touring, Yamaha's not real big in this. They've got the Tenere 700 and the Super Tenere. I have no idea, to be honest. I'm assuming the Tenere 700 meets EPA guidelines. I have no idea if the Super Tenere does. I'm betting the Tenere 700 does because because I'm betting they designed that R7 engine, that 700cc parallel twin, whatever the actual CCs are, because they plan to use it in a bunch of different machines. They wouldn't want it set up to be not emissions compliant. Like the stock exhaust, the stock setup is going to be emissions compliant because they want to use it across the range. Now, if we saw, say, a Tenere 700 Rally, not going to meet the requirements. But they're going to sell how many of those compared to the other ones? The touring bikes, again, I'm betting both of these easily meet emissions. You're talking big, powerful bikes, but you don't have to use all that power to pass the test. So you're not maxing out that throttle. You're not waiting to shift gears. You're keeping it at a gentle pace. Yeah. When you've got a bigger, heavier bike, it's relatively easy to meet emissions if you're not worried about getting every last little bit of power out of the bike. The people buying the Tracer and the FJR, yeah, they want a powerful bike, but they're not worried about every last little tiny bit of power. So yeah, Yamaha has themselves pretty well positioned to still offer the enthusiast a lot of fun, but still keep themselves clear of any EPA issues. We'll do this again for maybe Kawasaki, and then I might look at some European brands because they approach it very differently. Take care, have fun, stay safe, keep the rubber side down, and enjoy the ride.